In 1984, the rural hills of California still held the appearance of a place where bad things were believed to be far away. Small, winding roads snaked through the hillsides, so familiar you could drive with your eyes closed. Towns were quiet, where strangers were easily spotted, and most evenings passed in the gentle repetition of family meals, soft yellow lights, and the low hum of television. Life here was slower, gentler, and therefore more complacent. Danger was believed to be something only seen on the evening news, associated with unfamiliar names, big cities, addresses that would never belong to them. No one thought that a short trip, just a few miles of familiar road, could shatter that peace forever. No one thought that a seemingly meaningless evening could become the boundary between before and after, between gain and loss. And no one knew that, in the stillness of those hills that year, a story was quietly beginning. A story whose truth would only dare to speak 12 years later. The town where the Bennett sisters lived wasn't a place you'd pass through and remember forever, but rather a place you'd stay long enough to forget your vigilance. The low houses, their paint faded by the sun and wind. Small shops opened and closed at familiar times. Mornings began with the sound of pickup trucks starting. Evenings ended with the aroma of dinner wafting from open kitchens. Who went to work what time? Who came home late? Who lived alone? Who lived with others? Everything was so familiar that no question was needed. Here, people greeted each other with a nod, a brief question, and the belief that neighbors would notice if anything unusual happened. Safety didn't come from locks or alarms, but from the feeling that everything was within sight. It was this slow pace of life that made people believe that if anything happened, they would know immediately. But sometimes, that very familiarity lulled them into a false sense of security, because when everything seems too normal, people stop looking closely. And in that small town, amidst nameless streets and repetitive evenings, no one noticed that a void was silently forming, large enough to swallow 3 people without a sound. Laura Bennett is the eldest sister, 24 years old, and the quiet pillar of that small house. She lives with the feeling that if she slows down even a little, everything will fall apart. Laura is used to waking up early, checking bills, and remembering things others forget. She doesn't talk much about responsibility, she just does it. For Laura, love isn't about words, but about ensuring everything runs smoothly, safely, and intact. She's the kind of person her family naturally trusts because they know Laura would never disappear without a word. Emily, 21, lives a slower, more reserved life. She's quiet but not indifferent. Emily observes the world through minute details, a fleeting glance when someone lies, a brief pause in a voice, a subtle change in the atmosphere of a room. She's not the narrator, but often the one who understands the story best. Emily keeps everything inside, as if she believes silence is the safest way to avoid hurting anyone. Sarah, 18, is the youngest and most energetic child in the family. She carries the optimism of adolescence, the eagerness for a world yet to disappoint her. Sarah wants more than familiar paths, more than repetitive evenings. She laughs easily, dreams easily, and believes that life awaits her. But behind that smile, she remains a young girl unaware that innocence can sometimes be the most vulnerable. The 3 sisters weren't bound together in a boisterous way. They didn't need to constantly express their feelings. Their closeness lay in everyday things. Shared meals required little talking. Clothes were passed from hand to hand. Unfinished conversations continued days later, as if never interrupted. They were different, yet they formed a harmonious rhythm of life. And it was this familiarity that prevented any of them from imagining that one day, this simple bond would be severed in the most cruel way. That evening arrived gently, without any sign of anything unusual. The sunset slowly slid down the dry hills, painting the familiar road a pale orange, so peaceful that one forgot the passage of time. In the small house, everything unfolded as usual. No arguments, no tense silence, just an ordinary evening like hundreds of evenings before. The plan was simple: a short drive before dark, a quick stroll to clear their heads, then a late dinner. Laura took the car keys with the familiar ease of someone who was always the driver. Emily followed, asking few questions, simply putting on a light jacket. Sarah ran back to her room, rummaging through her cassette tapes, muttering to herself as she went about what music to listen to that night. No one was in a hurry. No one hesitated. No one felt the need to say anything more. They stepped outside while the lights in the house were still on. The door closed behind them, not locked properly. A dish was still lying haphazardly in the kitchen. Those small details at that moment meant nothing, because none of them thought that this would be the last time all three of them would leave that house together. Laura was driving. Emily sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window at the familiar roads that stretched past. Sarah sat in the back, flipping through cassette tapes, then stopping at one, pushing it into the player, as if choosing background music for a harmless evening. The car rolled along slowly, blending into the peaceful rhythm of the small town. It's the kind of trip that, once it happens, nobody remembers. No special moments to mark. No premonition to warn you. Just a few familiar miles, a few minutes of freedom before heading home. But it's precisely that ordinariness, that feeling of security, that masks a cruel truth. Some trips don't need to be far. They just need to be short enough for people to believe they'll definitely return. The next morning arrived in a very ordinary way, and that's what made it extraordinary. The sun rose behind the hills, its light illuminating the front yard as usual. But in front of the Bennett sisters' little house, there was no car parked, no door opened, no familiar footsteps echoed on the path. Initially, anxiety is just a very vague feeling. Maybe they're staying overnight at a friend's house. Maybe they're coming home late and are still resting. Relatives call, the phone rings for a long time then hangs up. No one answers. The first time, people still try to reassure themselves. The second time, the voice has slowed down. By the third time, the silence becomes heavier than the words. Those who knew Laura felt uneasy. She never disappeared without a word. Emily always kept in touch, even if it was just a short call. Sarah might be impulsive, but not to the point of causing all three of them to fall into absolute silence. This silence wasn't like forgetting, nor like indifference. It was more like something had stopped them midway, severing all their familiar routines. Time dragged on cruelly. With each passing minute, hope thinned a little more. The initial anxiety gradually turned into fear, then into a very clear premonition that no one wanted to name. Something had happened. Something unlike the usual mornings of this small town. And when noon came with no news, everyone began to understand that this wait wouldn't end as quickly as they had thought. By the end of that day, when the prolonged silence became unbearable, the local police were finally notified. The call was answered according to procedure. The voice on the other end was calm, even, as if it were just another file to be recorded. In 1984, adult disappearances didn't usually trigger an immediate sense of urgency. 3 adult women. No reports of violence. No prior signs of panic. The system was built to wait, not to act quickly. The officers asked the same old questions, questions that had been asked hundreds of times before. Had they argued? Did they have a boyfriend? Were there any financial problems? Were they involved with alcohol or drugs? The questions weren't wrong, but they were cold, because they assumed everything could be explained by some personal choice. The family answered each question, trying to remain calm, trying to believe that if they provided enough information, everything would be resolved. But time passed, and nothing further was triggered. No sirens, no immediate search teams. Just notes written down, brief nods, and promises that they would monitor the situation. For the Bennett family, that reaction was like a door closing very slowly. Not a violent slam, but a feeling of being trapped between two worlds. On one side, growing fear. On the other, a system of belief that perhaps it wasn't yet time to worry. The car was found late in the day, on a deserted stretch of country road, where most locals just drive past without ever stopping. It was lying askew. Not exactly an accident, nor did it look like it had been abandoned for a long time. It looked like a car that had just pulled over briefly, as if the driver had only intended to stop for a few minutes before returning to their journey. The car door was unlocked. The keys were missing. Inside, everything was chilling. The wallets were still there, lying carelessly on the floor. A jacket was draped over the back seat, as if someone had just taken it off thinking they'd be back soon. There were no signs of vandalism, no bloodstains, Not a single detail suggesting a violent struggle had taken place, but it was precisely this pristine state that made the scene seem so unsettling. On the control panel, the cassette player remained on. A tape was ejected halfway through, stuck between two moments. The song hadn't finished, but it couldn't continue either. It was as if a hand had reached out hastily, interrupting the sound without thinking. That moment, frozen in metal and plastic, spoke louder than any explanation. The investigators stood still for a few seconds longer than necessary. People don't leave a car like that without a reason, and three people wouldn't simultaneously step out of a car, leaving everything behind, unless something compelled them to do so. The car didn't tell the complete story, but it whispered a terrifying truth. That short journey had been cut short, not by choice, but by a sudden intervention, quick enough, unexpected enough that no one had time to react. Immediately after the car was discovered, the search expanded at the fastest speed the small town had ever seen. Local police, volunteers, neighbors, people who only knew the Bennett sisters' names from flyers, all poured into the surrounding hills. They walked in rows, shoulder to shoulder, calling out the three girls' names amidst the dry bushes and rough paths. The calls echoed, then faded into the empty space, with no answer. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors stirring up dust and dry leaves in a swirling mist. From above, the ravines, valleys, and trails were meticulously scrutinized, as if simply looking long enough would reveal the truth. Sniffer dogs were brought in, their noses pressed against the ground, trying to track any remaining traces. But the earth was dry, the wind had shifted, and time had done what it always did, so well erased every faint sign. No clothes were left behind, no footprints led anywhere. No sounds could be recalled. With each passing hour, hope eroded a little more. The searchers gradually came to understand the most difficult truth. If there were any traces, they had vanished. If there were cries for help, they were not heard. That once peaceful and familiar hilly region had become a vast and cold place, where three people could have completely disappeared without a trace. As the search dragged on, without yielding any further clues, theories began to emerge, though also more tenuous. Some believed the car had broken down, and the three sisters had received help from an untrustworthy stranger. Others thought of an accident, followed by panic and a series of missteps. Some even suggested they had left on their own accord, wanting to disappear from their old lives. But each of these theories, when juxtaposed with the intact wallets, the abandoned jackets, and the cut-off cassette tape, seemed untenable. People don't leave like that, not all at once, not everything behind. The police reviewed every piece of information, repeating the same old questions in the hope that time would make someone remember something that had been overlooked. But human memory fades like footprints on dry ground. No new witnesses. No clues strong enough to open a new line of investigation. Each additional report only thickened the file, not brought the truth closer. For the Bennett family, this impasse was another pain. No more frantic calls. No more urgent meetings. Only short, infrequent updates, and voices on the other end of the line growing more and more hesitant. The case wasn't closed, but it quietly slipped out of the present. Files were relegated to a deeper drawer. And in that silence, the three Bennett sisters became an unanswered question, fading with the years, while their family remained trapped on the first day of their wait. 12 years have passed, but for the Bennett family, time seems to have stopped on that evening in 1984. Life outside goes on, seasons change, cars still pass by the road in front of their house every day, but inside their home, everything is stuck in a prolonged silence. There is no end, no explanation, only a silent waiting that erodes day by day. The house, once filled with voices, now felt heavy. The rooms remained unchanged, as if clinging on. An empty bed, a shirt hanging behind the door, an empty chair at dinner. These small details reminded them that the three people hadn't vanished from memory, only from everyday life. The family lived in a state of both hope and fear. Hope that one day the door would open. Fear that day might never come. Birthdays became the most unsettling milestones. Each year, they had to wonder whether to celebrate or remain silent. Laura should have entered a different phase of her life. Emily should have made her own choices. Sarah should have grown up, changed, moved away from the image of the 18-year-old girl in their memories. But all those things that should have existed only in speculation, in whispered conversations, and in interrupted dreams. The pain of this waiting is not explosive, not dramatic. It simmers, lingers, not allowing one to cry it out. There is no funeral to end it, no farewell to close the chapter. Only a question hangs in the air between the Bennett family, day after day. And it is this ambiguity that becomes the heaviest burden, forcing them to continue living, while their hearts remain forever stuck at the moment. The three sisters left the house and never returned. In the spring of 1996, at a California hospital, a seemingly anonymous admission quietly reopened a story buried for 12 years. The woman was brought into the emergency room in a state of exhaustion, dehydration, and evident confusion. She had no identification. No family members were with her. Her clothes were worn and tattered, not the dirtiness of a short trip, but the sign of prolonged neglect. On her body were layers of old and new bruises, like memories that had never had time to heal. Initially, no one connected this case to a disappearance that had occurred more than a decade earlier. Long enough time had passed for the name Bennett to fade from most people's memories. But when asked her name, the woman hesitated. She took a deep breath, as if considering whether it was safe to say it. Then she answered, her voice low and slow, almost a whisper, "Sarah Bennett." That name brought a moment of silence to the room. A nurse stopped what she was doing. A doctor looked up. There are names, long forgotten, that carry an indescribable weight. Phone calls followed, quiet but urgent. Old files were pulled out. Fingerprints were compared. Procedures proceeded faster than usual, fueled by a feeling that this was no coincidence. When the confirmation came back, the silence turned into stunned silence. The youngest of the three Bennett sisters, the girl who had disappeared on a short trip in 1984, was still alive, but there was no obvious joy on Sarah's face. Only fear was clearly visible, as if being found was not the end, but the beginning of a new danger. When Sarah's identity was confirmed, her reaction was unlike any scenario one might imagine for someone returning after 12 years of disappearance. There was no outburst of tears, no apparent relief. Instead, there was a complete rigidity, as if she were bracing herself for the next terrible thing to happen. Sarah's eyes constantly searched for an escape. Her hands trembled slightly even as she lay still. For her, being seen did not mean safety. Sarah's first question wasn't about her family, not about her two sisters. She asked if anyone else knew she was there. That question made those present realize that Sarah's fear wasn't a thing of the past. It was still alive with her, every minute, every second. The years that had disappeared hadn't just taken away time. They had reshaped how a person sees the world. Who to trust, who to avoid, where to be safe, where not to be. The trauma specialists quickly recognized the familiar signs. Excessive vigilance, a startle reflex at the slightest sound. Sarah's choice to remain silent instead of responding wasn't because she didn't want to speak, but because she was accustomed to silence as a means of survival. For her, survival was never a victory. It was a condition, a state to be maintained by constantly being prepared for danger. In that moment, everyone began to understand that Sarah's return wasn't the end of a sad story. It was the beginning of a heavier truth. A truth carried within the body and mind of someone who had lived in darkness for so long that even the light had become something to fear. It took Sarah days, even weeks, to begin recounting what happened that night in 1984. No one pressured her. The conversations were slow and fragmented, always with a psychologist present, because Sarah's memories weren't in chronological order. They came in fragments, in waves, like sudden surges that washed in and then receded, leaving her exhausted. She recounted that night, when the car stopped, everything happened so quickly. It wasn't a coincidence. Not a lone stranger. The men appeared with a terrifying calmness, as if they had been waiting. Each had a role. Some spoke to distract, some watched, some gestured. No one shouted. No one panicked. The control was exercised in silence, and that's what made it effective. Sarah vividly remembers the feeling of being cut off from her familiar world in just a few minutes. The familiar road vanished. The town lights faded into the distance. They were taken to a remote place, chosen not by chance, but so that no one could hear them, no one could see them. Time became distorted from that moment on. Day and night merged. Fear became the rhythm of life. She didn't delve into every detail of the behavior. She didn't need to. The flatness in her voice, the averted gaze, said enough. Sarah described the violence as a system, not an impulse. There were rules, there were punishments, there were mandatory silences. In that world, questioning meant risk. What sent chills down the investigators' spines wasn't just the content, but the way it was organized. This wasn't a spontaneous crime. It was a plan. A group of people knew what they were doing, knew how to leave no trace, and knew that the victim's silence was their best protection. When the testimony ended, the room fell silent. The missing person case from years ago had been renamed. It was no longer an unanswered question. It was an organized kidnapping, perfectly concealed for over a decade. Following Sarah's testimony, the investigation changed almost immediately. For the first time in 12 years, the investigators no longer had to speculate from a blank slate. They had a real person, a living memory, a chain of details remembered not to be told, but to exist. Old files were brought out of the archives, dusted off, and reread with a completely different perspective. Details that had once been considered disjointed suddenly found their place. The locations Sarah mentioned were narrowed down. Vehicles, habits, voices, seemingly insignificant details now became key. Investigators began connecting previously isolated cases from the 1980s. Old reports from neighboring counties, unsolved disappearances, testimonies previously dismissed due to lack of evidence. A pattern gradually emerged, cold and organized. This time, the police weren't in a hurry. They followed, verified, patiently reconstructed every step of those involved. No sirens, no noisy raids. Just arrest warrants signed in silence. Each suspect was arrested individually, like links removed from an old but dangerous machine. With each name brought into the interrogation room, Sarah's fear resurfaced, for memories didn't distinguish between the past and the present. But this time, she wasn't alone. The truth Sarah carried finally had a place to stand. And when the handcuffs were locked onto the suspect's wrists, it wasn't a complete victory. It was the first moment in years that justice began to walk, slowly but irreversibly, toward the Bennett family. The new investigation led forensic teams to locations that had previously existed only as vague names on maps. Abandoned houses, forgotten plots of land, places so ordinary that no one would have thought they could hold secrets for years. The work proceeded slowly, cautiously, layer after layer of earth being removed in heavy silence. No one spoke much. No one needed to speak. Everyone understood they were getting very close to something no one wanted, but everyone had to face it. When the truth came out, it didn't come in a dramatic moment. It came in tiny signs, enough to make everyone stop. Enough to leave no room for doubt. Laura and Emily had been found. No longer just names on flyers. No longer a hypothesis. No longer a vague hope. They hadn't survived the years of being missing. The news was delivered to Sarah in a dark, enclosed room. She was speechless. There were no immediate tears. Just a long silence, where everything she had carried in her heart for 12 years was suddenly confirmed. Knowing and believing are two different things. The truth, when named, weighs heavily. For the Bennett family, that moment was both the end and the beginning of another tragedy. They finally had the answer, but at the cost of the permanent loss of 2 children. No more waiting. No more glimmer of hope. Only the stark truth and the need to learn to live with it. Laura and Emily were no longer missing. They had returned, in the most painful way, and that truth brought an end to 12 years of uncertainty with an unwanted period. The trial unfolded unlike what one might imagine a conclusion to. There was no dramatic climax, no moment of complete liberation. Only long days spent in the courtroom, where the truth was dissected with cold words and strict procedures. The accused sat there, silent, sometimes bowed their heads, sometimes blank. They didn't have the faces of monsters. They looked so ordinary it was hard to accept. Sarah was present for part of the trial, but not all of it. She knew her limits. There were things she could hear more of, things that would drag her back to where she had been trying to escape for years. When her testimony was read, the room fell silent. Not because of surprise, but because of the weight of what was said. Each word was a piece of memory placed on the table of justice, irretrievable. The sentence was pronounced in due process. The punishment was long. Some people will never leave prison. But when the gavel struck, there was no sense of relief. Justice, in this case, brings no healing. It doesn't erase memories. It doesn't turn back time. It only confirms one thing, that what happened was real, and those who caused it must be held accountable. For the Bennett family, the trial closed a legal chapter, but not the pain. They left the courtroom with more questions than answers. The truth had been told. Justice had been served. But the voids in their lives remained, silently, impossible to fill with any verdict. After the trial, Sarah's life didn't return to normal, because normalcy was a concept that had long since vanished. Justice had been served, but the trauma didn't leave with the verdict. It remained, changing form, creeping into the smallest moments of daily life. A sudden sound. A familiar smell. An empty street late in the afternoon. These seemingly harmless things were sometimes enough to pull Sarah back to a place she had tried so hard to escape. The healing process was slow and not linear. Some days Sarah felt almost okay, able to laugh, to talk, to believe she was living, not just existing. But there were also days when memories flooded back without warning, causing her to withdraw, become quiet, and exhausted. Sarah learned that healing isn't about forgetting, but about learning to carry memories without letting them control her decisions. The greatest burden she carried wasn't just fear, but also the guilt of surviving. Why me? Why not them? These questions remained unanswered, yet they lingered, a part of her existence. Sarah had to learn to accept that her survival wasn't a betrayal, but the only thing she could hold on to. For Sarah, moving on wasn't about forgetting the past, but about confronting it each day, in small steps. She rebuilt her life in silence, cautiously, but purposefully. Not to run away, but to stand firm. And in each of those steps, Laura and Emily were still present, no longer as unanswered questions, but as a painful, yet real, part of her memories that Sarah carried with her to continue living. The Bennett sisters' story doesn't end with a sudden twist or a complete sense of liberation. It ends with the truth. Slow, heavy, and irreversible. Laura and Emily are remembered not for how they left this world, but for who they were before their peace was shattered. Sarah lives on, not as a miracle, but as proof that some pains don't disappear, they just learn to coexist with us. The road from 1984 is still there. Cars still pass by every day. Music still plays on short journeys. Most people are unaware that, in that seemingly harmless place, there was a moment when the lives of 3 people diverged forever. This story reminds us that sometimes danger doesn't appear in a terrifying way. It lurks in the most familiar things, in the moments when we believe we are safest. If you've read this far, take a moment to think about the short trips in your life, the things you assume you'll definitely return to. And if this story made you think, leave a comment. What do you think made them stop their car that night? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following other stories, where the truth doesn't always come out loud, but when it does, it leaves a lasting mark on those who remain.